at the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that the Foundation acknowledges the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the First Peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways upon which we live and work. I'm on Wurundjeri land, and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the First Peoples and custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that participants are spread across Victoria and even interstate today, and therefore I'd like to acknowledge all First Peoples across Australia. Video gaming is a popular form of entertainment among many young Australians, but gaming and gambling often share similarities in appearance, interactive features and elements of chance. Simulated gambling products have the potential to normalise and encourage monetary gambling, especially among children and young people. This session will look at the key findings from the 2022 report, What is the link between video gaming, gambling and harm? The report authors, Dr. Sekata and Dr. Rebecca Jenkinson from the Australian Gambling Research Centre, will highlight the findings from their review in the range of negative consequences associated with products such as simulated gambling games, loot boxes, and other in-game purchases, and the recommendations in the literature for reducing harm. Our format for today's session will go as follows. Basically, we'll have a quick introduction to our two presenters, and then our presenters will present for approximately around about 30 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A session, which Luke Duffy, who's our research officer at the VRGF, who will oversee and manage that. So just a reminder, please feel free to place any questions you may have in the chat box during and or at the conclusion of the presentation. And Luke will select as many of these questions within the timeframe and direct these to either Kai or Rebecca. And then I'll basically come back with a final summary and a bit of a closure. Just a reminder, if you can please ensure that your cameras and microphones are turned off during the presentation, and also this session is being recorded and we'll distribute the link if you know of anyone was by chance unable to attend. In relation to the presentation slides, we also will make these available in PDF format post the presentation, and we'll advise you via email when this will occur. So I'd like to now introduce our two presenters today, Dr. Kai Sekata, who's an economist with more than 20 years experience working with large data sets using advanced econometric methods. He's conducted policy evaluations in the areas of health economics, labour economics, and demographic research. Also, we have Dr. Rebecca Jenkinson, who's the Executive Manager of the Australian Gambling Research Centre. She also holds an Honorary Burnett Institute Fellow position in the Behaviours and Health Risk Program and the Burnett Institute,
18 months.
and an adjunct lecturer in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University. And Rebecca also has extensive experience in public health research, most recently in gambling and alcohol and other drug fields. So thanks, Kai and Rebecca, for your time today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the really warm welcome. On behalf of Kay and our co-authors, I'd really like to thank you and the Foundation for the invitation to come along and present some of our findings today. We're really delighted to be here. And I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that's come up now for the audience. Beautiful. Thanks, Etty. So as Mark's mentioned, Kay and I will be presenting some findings on two recent studies that we've done, really looking at that link between video gaming, gambling and harm. So, I mean, it probably won't be new for this audience, but we do know the past decade or so, we have really seen an increase in the monetization of video games. So often known as microtransactions, but where you can purchase items in games. So things like cosmetic features that you might put on your character, costumes, or things like weapons. We've also seen a big increase in games with chance-based items. So what will be commonly known to people as loot boxes, and an increase in simulated gambling games. These increases have really led to concern kind of throughout the general community, but also this is an issue for researchers, obviously, and policymakers and treatment providers as well. But really about, what does this increase in the availability of an engagement with these products mean? And concern around the potential to expose and normalise and encourage monetary gambling. And there's a particular concern at the moment around young people, children and young people, and their exposure to these products. But also, how might people who engage with these products potentially experience harm related to them? So gambling related harms, but also other impacts on finances, obviously, and health and well-being. So kind of building on that concern and interest in the sector around this, we conducted two recent studies really to improve this understanding of the links and potential harms associated with engaging with these products. The first thing we did, and this was a literature review, and it was led by Nancy Greer and Kayla Murray-Boyle in our team. This was a review we did that was funded by the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communication and the Arts. And they were really interested in improving understanding of what, if any, harms are related to these products, and what's the literature saying around potential mitigation strategies for that. So we conducted that review in the second half of last year. And the second study that we'll talk to today, this is some research that Kay has done recently, really building on the longitudinal data that we have here at AVES, so our longitudinal study of Australian children, really looking over time at what are those links between engaging in video gaming as an adolescent and going on to gamble with real money as an adult. These were the three, I guess, groups of products that the Department of Communications were really interested in us looking at for our literature review. So they were interested in in-game purchases. So these are those microtransactions, or those items that they might be the aesthetic items, so those cosmetic items or weapons. They might help you move further in a game, so offer gameplay advantage. Or they might include contents of a randomized content, so the loot boxes that we're talking about. The Department of Communications did want us to look at loot boxes separately, and obviously this is probably the most common product that is spoken about in the literature, and certainly in kind of policy circles at the moment. So they really are those mystery boxes, or those mystery chests that do contain those random in-game items. That you can pay for loot boxes, or they can also be obtained via gameplay, via gameplay. And the third product they were interested in was the simulated gambling games. And Kay will talk a little bit more about these products when he gets to his half of the presentation. But these are those games that really do resemble real life casino games, so casino table games or pokies. So these are the products we're really talking about today, and particularly when we were looking at harm related to these in-game items. We're really, the language that we use, and I know most of this audience would be using now, is around harm. We're interested in understanding harm related to gambling, and that's our work, but also now looking at these links with video gaming. But in terms of the literature that we reviewed, certainly gambling problems and problem gambling is really what has been used in the literature up until now. And really that's based on the fact that these were the two scales that people have used. So the PGSI, the Problem Gambling Severity Index, was the most widely used scale in all of the research that we reviewed. And then Internet Gaming Disorder as well was another scale that had been used in quite a bit of the research that we reviewed. So we do talk about harm, but in this paper, we also talk about experiencing gambling problems based on the scales that have been used in the research. So just briefly, I'll just kind of step you through the literature review that we did that was led by Nancy. And really, the aims of it in working with the Department of Communications were really to assess what harms, if any, were associated with engagement with those 3 types of products that we've mentioned. They were looking to identify which groups might be more at risk or vulnerable, was their language, to experiencing harm. And a key part of the review was really also to identify those recommendations for responses to reduce harm. So in terms of regulation or other kind of consumer protection measures. So we reviewed the literature over the past 10 years. Most of the research that we reviewed was really in the past 2 to 3 years has come out, but we reviewed it from past 10 years and we identified 67 studies that really looked at the links between engagement with these products and harm. So they were kind of our eligibility criteria, kind of needed to mention harm or the other language that we've used. And really we were looking with that literature, we wanted to assess how generalizable it was to the Australian context. So we reviewed the international literature and really how similar is our gaming and gambling environment to other countries. And we were really looking at what was the strength of the evidence. So, was it a big meta-analysis that was a review of lots of different studies? Was it a big longitudinal study? So we were looking at how strong does this evidence seem, and then the value of it in terms of, the conclusions that they were able to come to and what it meant for the review we were doing. I'm really going to jump straight to the key findings, and so we can move on to some of Kay's work. But really what we found across all of the products that we looked at was reliable evidence that engaging with these products was associated with at-risk or problem gambling. If we look at the products, each product separately, so what we found is that loot box engagement, so that included viewing, opening, but especially purchasing loot boxes, was associated with the at-risk and problem gambling. But also what we found for loot boxes was a reliable association that was linked to internet gaming disorder as well. For the simulated gambling, but especially the in-game purchasing within social casino games, that was associated with at-risk problem gambling. And then the other in-game purchasing that we looked at, so not including loot boxes, that was also found to be associated with at-risk problem gambling. In addition, we found some evidence, and this is where I think there are still a number of gaps, but we found some evidence that loot box purchasing was associated with increased psychological distress and certainly some financial harms. Simulated gambling engagement, there was some evidence of it being associated with internet gaming disorder, and then some of the psychological emotional harms and other negative consequences. They were typically things like impacts on relationships or impacts on work and study. And then the other in-game purchasing, potentially some links there as well with internet gaming disorder, financial harms, and some of the impacts on mental health as well, particularly among adolescents for that product. Just to kind of try and summarize that in one spot for you, as I mentioned, really there does seem to be reliable evidence, certainly the literature we'd reviewed, of this association between engaging with these products. The higher the engagement, the more likely, but engaging with these products and being classified as being at risk of or experiencing problem gambling. Certainly some links with loot boxes and internet gaming disorder. Evidence is growing for the other products, and then some evidence of other types of harm. I think one of the reasons we don't have a lot of evidence here is because not a lot of surveys or research is asked about other types of harm. So as I said, a lot of them included the 2 scales that I've mentioned, but not many of them went into other types of harm. So I think that's something that's certainly would be looking to do some more research into, say, what are the other impacts especially on children and young people is an area we're interested in. We did, as I'd mentioned, the Department of Communications were really interested in which subpopulations might be more at risk of experiencing some of these harms. There are a lot of gaps in knowledge here. So again, more work needs to be done, but it does seem from the literature that children and adolescents were and are more at risk of engaging with these products, at risk of experiencing harm. We found some differences in gender. Seems that females who engage with loot boxes might be a bit higher risk and males other in-game purchases, but there's not a lot of evidence there yet. Certainly it was the participants in these studies who are engaging in more regular and higher in-game purchases, so spending more money. And certainly there seems to be a link with individuals who are also engaging in higher levels of gambling, for money gambling. So I guess in summary, what we did find was that greater engagement with these products across products predicted more harm. So that's, you know, it increased, I guess, the levels of harm from viewing them to opening them to purchasing them. But what's still unclear from a lot of the literature is whether engagement caused harm. So most of the literature was based on cross-sectional studies. So there's an association, but what's the order in which things happen? So that's where there's still a bit of a gap that some of Kay's research is hopefully starting to address that gap there. Just in terms of what the studies and the authors of the research that we reviewed recommended, typically their recommendations for kind of mitigation and regulation were focused around consumer protection measures. So they certainly included age restrictions. Most of the literature recommended age restrictions for people under 18 years. Removing or reducing some of those features that might encourage excessive expenditure. So some of those pay to win, pay to get ahead features or even rare items. The literature speaks of options for limit setting, as we're talking about with gambling now. So putting limits on how much you're willing to spend on these products and how much time, and also self-exclusion type options. Clear labeling of gambling-like products and features in video games was often mentioned, as was regulation of these products via existing gambling laws. Some of these measures and ideas are certainly being proposed at the moment. Andrew Wilkie has put a bill up around classification of loot boxes, and he's certainly recommending age restrictions and clear labeling, especially for parents. So there's some work being done, and obviously there's the inquiry into online gambling that's going on at the moment, which is touching on these products as well. So I'll just pass over to Kay now, and he can talk you through the LSAC research.
Hi. Okay. So what I've done here is to look at how these links Bex talk about association between video gaming and gambling. So is this really just an association, or is it actually causal link? That's actually what we have done for the this project. So what we did was we examined the causal effects of video gaming on gambling among young people in Australia. In particular, we looked at simulated gambling games. So there are a couple of examples of simulated gambling games here on the bottom of the screen, where one shows simulated pokies, the other show simulated table casino game. So with simulated casino game, you can interact with other players and really sort of simulate experience you get from casino table game. It's important to stress that these games don't usually involve money betting. I'm gonna touch that later on. So some parents are already concerned about this type of products. Communities are concerned about this type of products or potential harm and maybe normalization of real money gambling. Department of Communication and Arts did some review of this issue, surveyed parents. Parents are saying that they want to see tougher regulations on these products. Currently, a lot of products are classified M instead of N. They're asking for tougher restrictions on these games, maybe MA 15 or even like R 18 plus. So what we did was look at longitudinal study of Australian children we call LSAC. This data is a longitudinal study, so best suited for transitional studies or child development studies, how children transition to one stage to another. So it's an ongoing nationally representative study, and LSAC contains two cohorts. one cohort is called birth cohort, B cohort, and the other called kinder cohort, K cohort. We are using this kinder cohort for this analysis. Each cohort contains 5,000 children in 2004, and this study followed these 5,000 students for each cohort for every 2 years over now 10 waves. And LSAC contains very rich information, so you can sort of look at their questionnaire. It's really massive. It also contains video gaming and gambling questions. Video gaming questions are asked in wave 5 to wave 7, so 3 waves. Frequency of using computer-like device to play video games. And also from wave 7, which is their 16 and 17 years, which is not the legal age of gambling, but we asked, LSAC asked questions about the gambling participation. And wave 8, when they turned into the legal age of gambling. So LSAC asked money spent on 10 gambling products in the last 12 months. Scratches, bingo, lotto or lottery games, Keno, private betting with friends or family, poker, casino table games, poker machines or pokies, betting on horse or dog races, and betting on sports. Sorry, this one. In wave 7, LSAC also asked questions about following question about simulated gambling games. Some electronic games like gambling, but do not involve betting money. Thinking about the last 12 months, how often have you played free games like this? Example, Zynga Poker, Slotmania, Big Fish Casino. Such games could be played in social network site, smartphone or tablet devices, or gambling consoles. This question sounds a little bit old because this survey in wave 7 was done in 2016, so sounds a little bit old, and current waves contains more recent questions about loot boxes and stuff. So interestingly, in wave 7, around 20% of 16 and 17 years old played simulated gambling games in the last 12 months. So 1 in 5. If you look at this figure by gender, this is more common for boys. Around 24% played simulated gambling games at the age of 16 to 17 years old, and compared to girls for 15%. So, 1 in 4 boys actually have played this kind of game at the age of 16 to 17. Now, let's look at gambling participation across 2 waves. So as I mentioned, the age 16 to 17, the underage gambling, when you look at the figure, around 16% of this cohort engaged in underage gambling when they are 16 and 17. And then once they hit the legal age of gambling, 18 and 19, that figure jumped. Around half of this cohort gambled in some products. Also, it's worthwhile mentioning that around 1 in 3 of this cohort gambled on pokies. This is actually one of the most popular products among this cohort at this stage. And let's look at at-risk gambling among this cohort. At wave 7, which is when their age is 16 to 17, around 2% of this cohort reported some gambling issues. But that number jumped to around 9% once they reached the legal age of gambling. So it's already we are observing some gambling issues among this cohort. Now, let's look at our main research questions. So this slide shows you the link between playing simulated gambling games during adolescent years and gambling participation when then turned into adulthood. So what we can see from here is those who played simulated gambling games are more likely to participate in gambling activities. So 42% to 59%. And we look at the top 5 most popular products among this cohort. And if you look at any products, they are more statistically significantly higher participation rates. And then what we did was we used this very sophisticated statistical model to look at the causal link between these two variables. So what we did was control as much as we can. As I mentioned, LSAC is a very rich data. So we can actually use all the available information, demographic characteristics, also other something like personality traits, risk preference, parents' information. We control for these fundamental variables that might actually have impacts on gambling and video gaming. And then also deal with some what we call endogeneity. So we dealt with some causal modeling issues and then come up with these findings. So what we found was adolescents who played simulated gambling games were more likely to engage in monetary gambling as adults. For any gambling, around 40 percentage points higher probability. And we also look at the top 5 products again, top 5 most popular products among this cohort. And then casino table games, race betting, and sports betting are the statistically significant products we found. And around 60%, casino table games, 26 percentage points higher probability, race betting, 29 percentage points higher probability, and sports betting, 25 percentage points higher probability. So there's actually link when adolescents played video game, simulated gambling games when they're 16 to 17, they're more likely to participate in real money gambling when they turn adulthood.
Thank you, Kay. I'm just going to summarize some of our presentation today before we open up for any questions. But really what we found in terms of our first study, so the literature review we did find that these products, so the loot boxes, the simulated gambling games, and other in-game purchases that we looked at were all found to be associated with at-risk or problem gambling in the literature, with growing evidence of an association with internet gaming disorder and other impacts on health and well-being. In terms of the study Kay's just mentioned, we did find that causal link between playing simulated gambling games as a 16, 17-year-old and going on to engage in real money gambling at 18, 19. And what we found really that stood out to us is that adolescents who played those games had a 40 percentage points higher probability of going on to engage in real money gambling. The other interesting and somewhat concerning finding for us was around the proportion of the sample who would already be classified as being at some risk of experiencing gambling problems or harm. So when they were 16 or 17, it was around 2% of the sample, but when they were 18, 19, so really just turned the legal age to gamble, it was almost 1 in 10 young people. And that's equivalent to around 54,000 young Australians who might be classified as being at some risk of gambling harm already. In terms of what next for us, and I know other researchers and policymakers are looking at where there are gaps now that we'd like to understand a little bit more. And really we are interested in unpacking these links a bit more between video gaming and gambling and the types of harms that people might be experiencing, particularly among children and young people, but also other potentially at-risk groups, but certainly there's a focus on children and young people. We're really interested in, and Kay's already doing this work, but looking at how engagement with these products and experience of harm might change over time. But it'll also be really important to think about how other factors, so potentially individual characteristics, but also how other product features, but particularly other monetary gambling might influence this engagement with these products and experience of harm. we're really hoping that our research can inform not only a lot of the inquiries that are going on at the moment, but that it can inform the classification and regulation of different types of video games and in-game purchases, but also around the development of tailored and targeted health promotion messages for both young people and parents about the potential harms associated with gambling. Really, just to thank everyone who's contributed to this work. We are indebted to the research participants for always the generosity of time that they give us to tell us their stories and about their experiences and their contributions to our work. We couldn't do any of this work without them. So I do want to make sure we acknowledge them. Of course, our funders, and we don't, the AGRC doesn't accept any funding from the gambling or other unhealthy industries as well. More information you can find about our centre at our website, but also we've included links to the 2 reports that we've briefly summarised today. Thank you. We'll just stop sharing our screen.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks, Kay. That's a really fantastic presentation. Very, very interesting. Just had a question come through from Lindsay here. So Lindsay wants to know, from the LIT review, were there significant differences between Australian children and young people compared to those overseas?
Oh, good question, Lindsay. Not from memory, no. I think certainly when we looked at, most of the studies we reviewed were generalisable to the Australian context. So they were either UK based or there were some Canadian studies. So no, we didn't really see differences there.
Were there differences in terms of the type of product you're talking about? So the social casino games versus loot boxes, it's just general in-game purchases?
Yes, yeah. So we did find some differences. Most of the research does focus on loot boxes. So that is also probably why there's the most evidence for that. But certainly, so for all of them, we did find that link with at-risk or problem gambling across products. But it was really about the more you engage with these products, the more likely you were to experience harm. So viewing the products sometimes was associated with harm, opening them more harm, but purchasing, it's really about the purchasing for a lot of these products was associated with most of the harm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that the purchasing, even if it's not so much the gambling component with the loot boxes, like if it's just general purchases, that's still related. Yeah. So what else? Part
of it's about say for those in-game purchases, it might be about trying to get ahead in the game. So people might be spending more and more money to kind of advance in the game. So I think it's not
with in terms of the simulated casino games that don't generally involve money, like what's the appeal in that for young people?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we ask people, in the literature certainly suggests that the motivations for engaging in social casino games are similar to being motivated to gamble on pokies. So part of it is about the enjoyment. People say they enjoy spending time with these products, but it was also around things like to escape troubles in life, boredom, to relax, all the same sorts of motivations we see when people tell us about why they gamble on pokies. We certainly see for social casino games. The other motivation that comes from the literature around social casino games is practicing for real money gambling. And one of the real concerns around that is social casino games are designed in a way, because the operators don't have to pay out any money, they're designed in a way to have you win more and win more often. So that's how they keep you engaged. So that's really setting people up, if they are thinking that this is for practicing for real money gambling, that's not the reality, right? So they are very different in that way.
Yeah. I think there's some evidence on that people who they're exposed to or primed to these sort of games where there's those, unnatural sort of rates of return, they're then more likely to gamble more when they actually get out in the real world and inevitably lose more than they win. So
yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, they have the kind of bells and whistles features of the pokie machines as well. So you do get that reward system, I guess, the dopamine.
Yeah, yeah. We've had a few more questions come in now. So the next one is, when looking at those young people who are at more risk of problem monetary gambling, are there any more insights into gender or other differences among those young people?
Oh, that's a very good question. We actually did it, but we didn't report the detail in our report, because what happened was we didn't have enough sample to say something more confidently. But what we can say from some of the findings we saw was boys are more likely to respond to simulated video gambling. Meaning, so if you look at the differences between men and women, boys and girls, when boys play simulated video gambling games, they're more likely to participate in gambling, but we didn't really observe same for the girls. So what we see from aggregated, we kind of combine both gender in the one equation, but when you sort of separate these two gender groups, then you don't really see link between playing simulated video gambling game and real money gambling for girls, but we see that in boys for any products. So it's more sort of, for us, we couldn't say, in out loud, because we actually have some sampling issue to nail our analysis. But yeah, that's how actually we found from our analysis.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess that's, yeah, it's probably to be expected, the way that boys tend to do these things. So the next question is, and this was from Tanya. So could we interpret the findings as showing people who have an interest in gambling as adolescents sustain that interest as adults? Is the proportion of 18 to 19-year-olds participating in risky gambling all that different from the proportion of adults generally?
So could you repeat that question again?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Okay,
actually, I cut it short because there's a lot to take in. Could we interpret the findings as showing people who have an interest in gambling as adolescents, they sustain that interest as adults? Is the proportion of 18 to 19-year-olds classified as participating in risky gambling all that different from the proportion of adults generally? And if not, should we worry? Is that?
So so that's actually a really good question, because this is a really crucial point as well. Because so the LSAC is only looking at this particular cohort. So it's not, we are not really looking at entire sort of young people, if that makes sense. So we probably need to, it's actually a very good research question. We can follow that up, right? So this is actually wave 8 when they are 18 and 19. So we can sort of follow up how these people actually fare in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And what we can actually see from, because I think the other point I need to actually mention is we don't really have a lot of information, longitudinal information about gambling activities for any data set. It's really, data is really limited. So at this moment, what we can see is using Hilda data to look at how people transition, right? So you can sort of look at some gamblers may actually start gambling, or those who actually gambling heavily may stop gambling. We can sort of see that. But, these are actually sort of some information available out there right now to actually see the transition. And I think that question is probably maybe next wave is available, wave 10, we can actually look at how that particular preference to gambling kind of continues on. But some of the, I think we kind of see a whole lot more movement that happens between two waves. When I actually checked Hilda data, I could sort of see people moving around quite a lot.
Yeah, they're great data sets, aren't they? Because it's one of those issues in this research. Is so much of it is cross-sectional.
Yeah, because it's all cross-sectional. So we really need a longitudinal study for gambling because, that's the part that we need to actually focus now.
Yep. Okay, so the next one is, so I know you may have covered it, but do we know the probability to go from online products to in-person products, such as poker machines?
We don't know from this study we're talking about today, but one of the things that was really interesting to us in Kay's analysis was that around 1 in 3 young people at 18, 19 reported gambling on pokies. So pokies was the product, the most common product that people reported gambling on, quite a bit higher than sports and racing. And Kay and I have been talking about that, and we think that's got a lot to do with availability and accessibility. So they're going into venues to have drinks with their friends, and they're going out, they've turned 18 and 19, and the poker machines are there. So we think it's about availability, I think.
Yeah.
And also from this study, because we are using both males and females in the sample, kind of like a females effects kind of absorb male effects. So we didn't see the statistically significant impact on gambling on pokies as adults. How people these young adolescents play simulated gambling games didn't look like a lead to playing on pokies. But when you actually divide the sample, males actually have statistically significant impact on gambling on pokies as adults. So that's actually the note I should actually make.
Okay. So the next one, does the research touch on parental influence in either way?
Yeah, we didn't report in this presentation, but we did actually found if parents are gambling, then around 10 percentage points higher probability of kids to participate in gambling as adults. So that's our finding.
Yep. Okay. And I guess this sort of follows on from earlier, but has this sort of longitudinal data been used in this way before?
No, I don't think so. Because again, longitudinal studies are pretty limited. And now we can use Hilda, Tentumen, and LSAC has got some kind of more than 2 waves to tease out some of the transitional analysis in terms of gambling. But again, even Hilda, we don't, or Elsa, or any of the studies I mentioned, they don't have lots of questions on gambling. Or now we sort of adding more questions into LSAC about video gaming. But all the researchers have different interests, and they're not all gambling researchers. So you know what I mean. So we only have really limited space, and we constantly fighting for the space to add more, gambling questions. But these are probably some of the longitudinal studies. So longitudinal analysis are still limited in this space. So I'm hoping that more researchers would engage in this kind of analysis.
Yep. Just on the questions that were asked, because I think you said that the question for this, that this was based on, was about the frequency of playing certain types of games, like they were called like gambling-like games or something like that. And then you mentioned something about in the future them changing or being more detailed. Do you know what precisely they might ask? Like, will it be about specific products like loot boxes and the like?
Yeah, it is. Thanks, Luke. And we can pull out. I think they've just completed data collection for wave 10. But certainly we worked on those with Nancy Greer here as well. So we've got questions around loot boxes, we've got questions around other in-game items, and we've got questions around social casino games. They're much more detailed, the questions we've been able to include more recently. We've also got questions around what kind of funds they use, so whether it's crypto or cash or credit, those sorts of things as well. So the questions, the most recent questions are much more detailed, which will be fantastic.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, it's great data as it is, but yeah, you'll be able to do so much more, I guess, with those specific questions. So the next one says, excellent presentation. Thank you. Based on what you previously mentioned, the research, we have seen states online sports betting is most common in 18 to 24-year-olds. Are you saying this research is actually stating pokies is the most common form of gambling?
I would be careful because we're just looking at 18 and 19. So they've just turned 18, really. They've just started gambling. And a lot of our research suggests that that's around the average age young people might start gambling. But I think what you've just mentioned is looking at an older age group or larger age group.
Yeah.
And I think
include everybody in the young cohort, maybe like 18 to 35, that group. But I mean, here is only looking at the 18 and 19.
Yeah.
And from our other research, we certainly find sports betting participation and race betting much higher.
Yeah. There's probably a curiosity thing. They're out and they just try it for the sake of it.
And we don't have from that year's data, we don't have frequency. So that they might have just gone to the pokies once. As well. So in a lot of our other research, we do capture frequency of engaging, with these products. But yes, sports betting and race betting is certainly really a key focus for this age group.
Yeah. So the next question is, does the research come across any protective factors to gambling harm?
That's a really good question. There's a little bit of research. There's not enough. We don't know enough yet. Some research is starting to look at peer networks and whether that might be protective, peer and family networks. There's some work being done around kind of individual characteristics, around personality traits and other sorts of things, but not enough yet to really unpack that. Most of the research is looked at the correlates of harm.
Yeah, again, I think Beck touched a little bit about how we measure gambling harm as well. So now we are predominantly using PGSI scores, but there are actually other types of harms that we need to actually address, and we probably need to address more about financial stress or impacts on family. These kind of stuff is still pretty limited in terms of measuring gambling harm.
Yeah, I guess that's an issue generally in the gambling research. Okay, that one's a statement. Is there evidence for possible interventions to reduce harm amongst young people?
Oh, that's a really good question. So a lot of this research did point to those areas. There are recommendations for what could be done in terms of regulation or, around kind of consumer protection. But and in some jurisdictions, they're starting to introduce some of these things. So, for example, in Belgium and the Netherlands, loot boxes are now being classified as gambling. So in some countries, we're certainly moving ahead with some of those mitigation strategies, but they haven't been evaluated. So it's hard to know actually what impact they might have, which is one of our big challenges. And I think we're hoping that our findings will inform classification and regulation of these products in Australia. So then we can evaluate it to see, does it help kind of prevent and minimize harm?
Yep. So thanks so much, Beck and Kay. Fantastic presentation and answered the absolute load of questions really, really well. So yeah, thanks so much for that. And I'll throw it back to Mark.
Thanks, Luke. And I'm sure on behalf of the people who've attended this webinar, big thank you to Kai and Rebecca for your time and the many insights that you've provided, and probably clearly identify the need for us to continue to invest, educate our youth about the potential of some of the associated risks with gaming to gambling. Thanks to Luke for leading the Q&A. We had obviously a lot of questions, which is probably a great reflection of the level of interest in this particular topic at the moment. Obviously, as usual, Eddie is behind the scenes ensuring the technology part of the webinar works well and assists with the promotion and registrations of the event. Also, just as I mentioned at the commencement of the webinar, we'll be in touch via email in relation to a link to the recording of this session, a copy of the presentation slides, and also a brief survey about the presentation, but also to identify any topics that you would like to learn further about. Based on the theme today, I also like to probably just acknowledge from the VRGF perspective, what are we doing in this particular space? Through our Gamblers Help Community Educator Network, we were delivering education sessions in our secondary schools. We've got a When Gaming Meets Gambling presentation that we deliver to years 7 to 12. We're soon to release a parent presentation education session that we'll be delivering through our community educator network. And we're also about to release a new upper primary teacher curriculum resource entitled The Bridge, which really focuses from a curriculum perspective on loot boxes and an array of gambling related options. So we're doing a fair bit of work in this space. We know we want to do more. There's parent and carer information sheets on the VRGF website. And also for those people who may have attended the sessions or may not have been able to, in 2022, we had some youth webinars about loot boxes from Dr. Jim Sauer from University of Tasmania and Dr. Kim Lee, who talked about treatment, about gaming addiction. So these sessions have been recorded and you can view them from the VRGF website. So we feel we're being quite proactive in this space and we know we can do a lot more, but excited to hear about the learnings to reinforce what Kai and Beck have provided us to help us with our future planning and our education sessions. So thanks again, Kai and Beck. Really enjoyed the presentation and importantly, your time being a part of this process. So finally, everyone, stay safe, stay well, and enjoy the remainder of your Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.